What if the sacred process that selects the leader of the world's largest religious institution isn't as divinely guided as we've been led to believe? What if behind the white smoke and solemn oaths lies a complex web of political maneuvering, secret alliances, and even outside influence? The selection of a pope affects over 1 billion faithful worldwide, yet few understand the hidden dynamics that may actually determine who sits on the throne of St. Peter. When secrecy surrounds power, truth becomes the first casualty of tradition. Unknown. To most Catholics and outside observers, a papal conclave represents the epitome of sacred tradition. Cardinals from around the world gather in the Sistine Chapel, sealed away from outside influence, to pray and discern who among them should lead the Church as the successor to St. Peter. They take solemn oaths to maintain secrecy and to vote according to conscience, free from faction or favor. When white smoke finally rises from the chapel chimney, it symbolizes not just a completed election, but supposedly the will of the Holy Spirit made manifest through human instruments. This idealized portrayal of the conclave process has been carefully cultivated for centuries. It presents papal selection as a spiritual exercise rather than a political contest, a sacred discernment rather than a human competition for power. But historical evidence and occasional glimpses behind the Vatican's veil of secrecy tell a different, more complicated story. Throughout history, papal elections have been influenced by factors far removed from divine guidance. National interests, family dynasties, and political alliances have all played significant roles in determining who would sit on the papal throne. During the Middle Ages, powerful Italian families like the Medicis and Borgias essentially controlled the papacy, producing popes who advanced family interests rather than spiritual priorities. Later, Catholic monarchs of Spain, France, and Austria claimed and sometimes exercised a right of exclusion, jus exclusivae, formally vetoing papal candidates they found objectionable. Modern papal elections, while free from such overt interference, still reflect human dynamics and strategic considerations that rarely surface in official accounts. The conclave that elected Pope John Paul II in 1978 followed complex negotiations between competing factions of cardinals. His successor, Benedict XVI, emerged from a conclave where pre-election discussions reportedly centered on the need for a doctrinal conservative to consolidate. John Paul II's legacy. Pope Francis's election in 2013 came after what some observers have described as coordinated efforts by reform-minded cardinals seeking a decisive break from curial business as usual. These realities raise uncomfortable questions about the conclave process. If papal elections involve factional politics, strategic voting, and organized campaigns for preferred candidates, how does this square with the narrative of spiritual discernment? If cardinals enter the conclave with clear agendas and coordinated strategies, can the outcome truly be attributed primarily to divine guidance? The mechanisms of the conclave themselves create conditions where human factors may override spiritual considerations. The requirement for a two-thirds majority to elect a pope necessitates coalition building and compromise. The sequential balloting process, with 4 votes per day, creates pressure toward consensus that may have more to do with pragmatic considerations than spiritual discernment. The confined environment of the conclave, where cardinals are sequestered together without outside communication, intensifies personal dynamics and can amplify the influence of persuasive individuals. Evidence for coordinated influence in recent conclaves has occasionally emerged despite strict secrecy requirements. Cardinal Godfried Daniels of Belgium acknowledged in his 2015 authorized biography that he had been part of a self-described mafia club of progressive cardinals who met regularly in St. Gallen, Switzerland, to discuss church reforms and potentially to strategize about papal succession. This group reportedly opposed Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's election in 2005 and may have supported Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio, later Pope Francis, as an alternative. Similarly, journalist Edward Pentin reported in his book The Next Pope that before the 2013 conclave, certain cardinals conducted an organized campaign for Cardinal Bergoglio, despite rules prohibiting such campaigning. According to these accounts, key cardinals systematically lobbied colleagues during the pre-conclave general congregations, building support for Bergoglio as a reform candidate who could address perceived institutional failures. Under Benedict XVI, these reports suggest that far from being spontaneous movements of the spirit, papal elections may involve careful planning, coordinated voting strategies, and organized campaigns, elements more commonly associated with political contests than spiritual discernment. The contrast between this reality and the official narrative of divine guidance creates a disconnect that few within the church hierarchy publicly acknowledge. Beyond internal church politics, external factors may also influence conclave outcomes in ways rarely discussed. While direct interference by governments has diminished since the early 20th century, more subtle forms of influence persist. Cardinals inevitably bring cultural perspectives and national interests into the conclave. Media narratives about the Church's needs and challenges shape pre-conclave discussions. Financial considerations, including the Vatican Bank's relationships with global financial institutions, create contexts that may favor certain candidates over others. The conclave's vulnerability to external influence became particularly apparent in recent decades, as the Vatican faced increasing scrutiny over its handling of sexual abuse cases, financial scandals, and internal governance challenges. These pressures arguably created conditions where cardinals felt compelled to select leadership that could address specific institutional crises rather than focusing exclusively on spiritual qualifications. For Catholics and others trying to understand these complex realities, several key questions emerge. How much of what happens in a conclave truly reflects divine guidance, and how much reflects human strategy? If coordinated campaigning occurs despite official prohibitions, what does this reveal about the integrity of the process? Can a system designed in earlier centuries effectively select leadership for a global church facing 21st century challenges? The historical patterns of influence and manipulation in papal elections reveal deeper systemic issues that challenge the idealized narrative of divine guidance. To truly understand the dark side of papal elections, we must examine specific mechanisms through which conclaves can be, and historically have been, influenced by factors far removed from spiritual discernment. One of the most significant yet rarely discussed aspects of conclave politics involves the pre-conclave period. While strict rules govern the conclave itself, the days and weeks preceding it include general congregations, where cardinals meet to discuss church affairs and, inevitably, potential papal candidates. These meetings, not bound by the same stringent secrecy rules as the conclave, provide critical opportunities for faction building, lobbying, and strategic coordination. During the pre-conclave period before Pope Francis's election in 2013, cardinals reportedly engaged in extensive discussions about the need for curial reform following the VatiLeaks scandal, which had revealed dysfunction and corruption within the Vatican bureaucracy. According to multiple accounts, cardinals from outside Rome, particularly those from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, coordinated to promote candidates who would address these governance issues, rather than selecting another European insider. This pre-conclave campaigning, while technically permitted as long as it doesn't involve explicit vote trading, effectively shapes the conclave before it even begins. Cardinals enter the Sistine Chapel having already formed opinions, alignments, and strategies based on these preliminary discussions. The spiritual discernment supposedly central to the conclave process thus becomes partially predetermined by very human networking and persuasion that occurs outside the chapel doors. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, who served as Dean of the College of Cardinals during the 2013 conclave, acknowledged in a subsequent interview that the pre-conclave meetings had significantly influenced the outcome. He noted that issues raised during these discussions, particularly concerns about financial transparency and curial reform, had created momentum for candidates perceived as outsiders to the Vatican establishment. The formation of voting blocs represents another aspect of conclave politics rarely acknowledged in official accounts. While each cardinal takes an oath to vote according to individual conscience, practical reality often involves coordination among cardinals who share theological perspectives, regional interests, or reform agendas. These informal blocs function much like political parties in secular elections, consolidating support behind particular candidates and sometimes engaging in strategic voting to block disfavored options. Evidence for such bloc voting emerged after the 2005 conclave that elected Pope Benedict XVI. According to journalist Sandro Magister, a group of about 40 cardinals, led by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who became Benedict XVI, formed a cohesive voting bloc, while a progressive alternative centered around Cardinals Carlo Maria Martini and Jorge Mario Bergoglio, later Pope Francis, constituted the main opposition. The sequential balloting process revealed these blocs through voting patterns, with Ratzinger's support gradually increasing as other candidacies failed to gain traction. National and regional alignments represent another form of bloc voting that affects conclave outcomes. Cardinals from the same country or region naturally share cultural perspectives and institutional concerns that may lead them to support similar candidates. Italian cardinals, who typically comprise about a quarter of conclave participants, have historically voted as a relatively cohesive bloc, helping to explain why the papacy remained predominantly Italian for centuries. This pattern shifted dramatically in 1978 with the election of Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyla as Pope John Paul II, the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. That breakthrough reflected changing demographics within the College of Cardinals and growing recognition that the Church's center of gravity was shifting to the global south. The subsequent elections of German Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, and Argentine Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio Francis continued this internationalization of the papacy. Yet even as the papacy has become less Italian, national and regional interests continue to influence conclave dynamics. In the 2013 conclave, Latin American cardinals reportedly coordinated their support for Bergoglio, seeing an opportunity to elevate the first pope from their region. European cardinals split between those supporting continuity with Benedict XVI's approach and those seeking more substantial reforms. North American cardinals, influenced by their experience of the clerical sexual abuse crisis, prioritized candidates who seemed likely to address that issue effectively. Beyond these regional blocs, ideological factions play perhaps the most significant role in modern conclaves. The polarization between progressive and traditionalist perspectives that characterizes much of contemporary Catholic discourse inevitably affects cardinal electors as well. While few cardinals fit neatly into simplistic, liberal or conservative categories, meaningful theological and pastoral differences create natural coalitions within the college. The St. Gallen group mentioned earlier represented one such ideological network. According to Cardinal Godfried Daniel's biographers, this informal association of progressive-leaning cardinals met regularly between 1996 and 2006 to discuss their vision for church reform, including their preferences for papal succession. Though their formal meetings reportedly ended before Benedict XVI's resignation, the relationships and shared perspectives developed through this group likely influenced the 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis. Similarly, more traditionalist cardinals have formed their own networks centered around shared concerns about doctrinal clarity and liturgical continuity. While less publicly acknowledged than the St. Gallen group, these traditionalist networks reportedly coordinated during the 2013 pre-conclave period to promote candidates who would maintain Benedict XVI's emphasis on theological orthodoxy and continuity with tradition. These ideological blocs typically align around specific issues that become conclave priorities. In recent conclaves, such issues have included the Church's response to secularization, approaches to doctrinal development, liturgical practices, clerical sexual abuse, Vatican finances, and curial reform. How cardinals position themselves on these issues significantly impacts their viability as papal candidates and their ability to build necessary coalitions. The conclave's voting system itself creates additional dynamics that can be manipulated by strategic actors. The requirement for a two-thirds majority, currently 86 out of 128 potential cardinal electors, means that a determined minority of 43 cardinals can effectively block any candidate they strongly oppose. This gives disproportionate power to organized factions that can maintain voting discipline through multiple ballots. The vulnerability of the conclave process to manipulation extends beyond internal church politics to include potential external influences that may shape papal elections in ways contrary to the idealized narrative of spiritual discernment. These external factors create additional layers of complexity that further challenge the notion of conclaves as purely sacred exercises. Historically, direct government interference in papal elections was common and often blatant. The right of exclusion, jus exclusivae, allowed Catholic monarchs of Austria, France, and Spain to formally veto papal candidates they found objectionable. This power was exercised as recently as 1903, when Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I vetoed Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, who had been the leading candidate. Following this incident, Pope Pius VI formally abolished the right of exclusion, declaring automatic excommunication for any cardinal who transmitted such a veto. While such direct intervention has ended, subtler forms of state influence persist. Nations with significant Catholic populations or strategic relationships with the Vatican naturally maintain interest in papal succession. Diplomatic communications, intelligence gathering, and indirect pressure through aligned cardinals represent potential mechanisms through which state interests might still affect conclave outcomes. The United States government's interest in papal elections became particularly evident during the Cold War. Declassified documents reveal that American intelligence agencies monitored the 1958 and 1963 conclaves closely, recognizing the strategic importance of papal positions on communism, nuclear weapons, and relations with Eastern Bloc countries. While direct American interference has not been conclusively proven, the extensive intelligence focus on these elections demonstrates the geopolitical significance attributed to papal succession. Similarly, Italian political interests have historically influenced conclave dynamics. The selection of an Italian or non-Italian pope carries significant implications for Vatican-Italian relations and for Italy's international prestige. Italian media coverage, political commentary, and cultural expectations create contexts that inevitably affect Italian cardinals' perspectives and priorities during papal elections. In more recent conclaves, media influence has emerged as a particularly significant external factor. While cardinals take an oath to avoid reading newspapers or accessing other media during the conclave itself, pre-conclave coverage shapes the narratives and expectations that cardinals bring into the Sistine Chapel. Media establishments worldwide engage in extensive speculation about papabili, potential popes, often highlighting candidates whose profiles align with the outlet's own ideological perspectives or national interests. The pre-conclave period in 2013 featured unprecedented media scrutiny following Benedict XVI's historic resignation. News organizations worldwide crafted narratives about the Church's needs and challenges, frequently emphasizing governance reform, financial transparency, and responses to the clerical sexual abuse crisis. These media framings likely influenced cardinals' perceptions of which candidates could effectively address the Church's most pressing issues. Financial interests represent another external factor rarely discussed in connection with papal elections. The Vatican Bank, officially the Institute for the Works of Religion, manages billions in assets and maintains relationships with major international financial institutions. The Vatican's handling of these resources has generated significant controversy, particularly following scandals involving money laundering allegations and questionable investments. These financial considerations create contexts where candidates perceived as capable financial managers or committed to financial reform may gain advantage. During the 2013 pre-conclave period, concerns about financial management reportedly featured prominently in cardinals' discussions, with some candidates gaining support for their perceived capacity to implement necessary reforms. The subsequent focus on financial transparency during Pope Francis's pontificate suggests these considerations significantly influenced the conclave outcome. Intelligence agencies' interest in papal elections extends beyond historical Cold War monitoring. Given the Vatican's diplomatic relations with 183 countries and its moral influence on over 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide, major powers naturally maintain intelligence focus on papal succession. Whether this monitoring translates to actual influence attempts remains speculative, but the potential for such interference adds another layer of complexity to conclave dynamics. The digital age has created new vulnerabilities in the conclave's historical isolation. While extraordinary measures are taken to shield the Sistine Chapel from electronic surveillance, including frequency jamming, specialized security sweeps, and removal of electronic devices, the sophistication of modern intelligence capabilities raises questions about whether complete isolation can truly be maintained. The potential for electronic surveillance of pre-conclave discussions, where most strategic coordination occurs, presents particular concerns. Beyond government influence, powerful Catholic organizations and movements have demonstrated capacity to shape conclave dynamics through their connections to cardinal electors. Groups like Opus Dei, Communion and Liberation, the Neo-Catechumenal Way, and the Community of Sant'Egidio maintain relationships with numerous cardinals and promote particular visions for the Church's future. While direct campaigning by these organizations would violate conclave rules, their long-standing influence on cardinals' theological and pastoral perspectives inevitably affects voting decisions. Financial support from wealthy Catholic donors to particular initiatives religious orders, or charitable works associated with certain cardinals potentially creates obligations or alignments that could influence conclave voting. While direct financial incentives would constitute grave violations of conclave integrity, more subtle forms of patronage and relationship building through financial support represent potential mechanisms of influence that the conclave system struggles to address. Corporate interests, particularly in media, banking, and technology sectors that interact with Vatican operations, may also seek to influence papal succession through their extensive networks and resources. As the Vatican increasingly engages with global capitalism through its investments, partnerships, and charitable initiatives, the potential for corporate influence on church governance, including papal selection, deserves greater scrutiny. Perhaps most significantly, the clerical sexual abuse crisis has transformed the context of papal elections in ways that create new vulnerabilities to manipulation. The severe reputational damage and financial liabilities resulting from abuse cases have placed unprecedented pressure on church leadership. Cardinals enter conclaves acutely aware that their selection must address this crisis effectively, awareness that can be exploited by factions. Promoting candidates based on their perceived ability to manage the scandal rather than their spiritual qualifications. The 2013 conclave following Benedict XVI's resignation occurred amid continuing revelations about abuse cases and institutional failures in addressing them. According to multiple accounts, cardinals from regions most severely affected by abuse scandals, particularly the United States, Ireland, and Australia, emphasized the need for leadership that would implement more effective responses to the crisis. This emphasis potentially advantaged candidates perceived as less implicated in previous institutional responses, including Cardinal Bergoglio from Argentina. These external pressures interact with internal church politics in complex ways that further challenge the spiritual integrity of the conclave process. When cardinals feel compelled to select leadership based on crisis management capabilities, media perception, or diplomatic skill, rather than theological depth or personal holiness, the connection between papal selection and divine guidance becomes increasingly tenuous. The combined effect of these internal mechanisms and external influences raises profound questions about the conclave system itself. If papal elections can be significantly shaped by factional politics, media narratives, corporate interests, and geopolitical considerations, can they truly be considered primarily spiritual exercises? If the outcome of a conclave can potentially be predetermined through strategic coordination before the formal voting even begins, does the elaborate ceremonial aspect serve mainly to provide spiritual legitimacy to what is essentially a political process? The potential for manipulation in papal elections extends beyond general influences to include specific tactics that could effectively rig a conclave outcome. These mechanisms, while rarely discussed openly, represent significant challenges to the integrity of the papal selection process. Sequential voting creates one of the most exploitable aspects of conclave procedure. Under current rules, cardinals vote up to 4 times daily until a candidate achieves the required 2/3 majority. This repeated balloting creates a dynamic where strategic voting becomes not merely possible, but practically inevitable. Cardinals can use early ballots to signal support for preferred candidates, test potential coalitions, or block disfavored options without wasting their definitive vote. This dynamic was evident in the 2005 conclave that elected Benedict XVI. According to leaked voting tallies published in the Italian magazine Limes, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger received 47 votes on the first ballot. Significant support, but far short of the required 2/3 majority. This initial showing demonstrated his substantial backing and created momentum that attracted additional votes in subsequent ballots, leading to his election on the fourth ballot with reportedly 84 of 115 votes. Such momentum effects can be deliberately manufactured through coordinated voting strategies. A well-organized faction can use early ballots to create the impression that their preferred candidate is gaining inevitable consensus, potentially influencing cardinals who desire to align with the prevailing direction or who wish to conclude the conclave expeditiously. This bandwagon effect transforms the sequential voting process from a repeated spiritual discernment into a strategic game with predictable psychological dynamics. The two-thirds majority requirement creates another tactical opportunity that sophisticated cardinal factions can exploit. A disciplined minority bloc of just over one-third of cardinals can effectively exercise veto power over any candidate they strongly oppose. By maintaining voting solidarity through multiple ballots, such a bloc can force compromise toward candidates acceptable to both major factions, potentially candidates who would not have emerged as first choices in a simple majority system. This blocking dynamic reportedly influenced the 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis. According to accounts from Italian Vatican journalist Andrea Tornielli, a substantial block of reform-minded cardinals consistently voted against candidates perceived as representing continuity with Benedict XVI's approach or too closely aligned with the Roman Curia. This forced consideration of compromise candidates, ultimately benefiting Cardinal Bergoglio, who presented a distinctive theological profile while promising needed governance reforms. Information control represents another aspect of conclave politics that sophisticated actors can manipulate. While cardinals take an oath of absolute secrecy regarding conclave proceedings, information inevitably circulates through informal channels, creating information asymmetries that strategic participants can exploit. Cardinals with extensive curial experience or well-developed networks often possess better information about voting patterns and emerging consensuses than their more isolated colleagues. During the 2013 conclave, cardinals from outside Rome, particularly those from developing nations with less representation in Vatican governance, reportedly formed information-sharing networks to counter this traditional advantage of curial insiders. This coordination helped maintain voting discipline among reform-oriented cardinals and prevented the fragmentation that had historically disadvantaged non-Italian candidates. The conclave's physical arrangement itself creates additional vulnerabilities to manipulation. Cardinals are seated in the Sistine Chapel according to seniority, with more recently appointed cardinals positioned where they can observe the voting behaviors of longer-serving colleagues. This arrangement potentially allows senior cardinals to signal preferences through visible ballot handling or body language, subtle cues that wouldn't violate the letter of conclave rules, but could influence less experienced electors. The role of the Cardinal Camerlengo, Chamberlain, and scrutineers, vote counters, creates another procedural vulnerability. These officials, selected partly by chance and partly by appointment, handle ballots and announce results, occupying positions where potential manipulation could occur. While the elaborate ballot counting procedure includes multiple verifications designed to prevent fraud, the system ultimately relies on the integrity of the individuals involved rather than truly independent verification. Beyond these procedural vulnerabilities, interpersonal dynamics create additional opportunities for conclave manipulation. The intense environment of a conclave, where cardinals are sequestered together in Spartan accommodations with limited external communication, magnifies the impact of persuasive individuals. Cardinals with strong personalities, effective rhetorical skills, or prestigious reputations can exercise disproportionate influence through private conversations between voting sessions. Cardinal Bergoglio reportedly benefited from such interpersonal dynamics in 2013. Despite his reluctance to promote himself as a candidate, his brief but powerful intervention during the pre-conclave general congregations, where he spoke about the Church becoming self-referential rather than reaching out to the margins, resonated with many cardinals seeking a pastoral rather than bureaucratic approach to church leadership. The role of conclave secretary, typically held by the Secretary of the College of Cardinals, creates another potential vector for influence. This official participates in the conclave without voting rights, but manages procedural aspects and facilitates communication. Their privileged position potentially allows subtle influence through procedural interpretations, agenda management, and information dissemination. During the 2013 conclave, Archbishop Lorenzo Baldisseri served as conclave secretary. Pope Francis subsequently appointed him Cardinal and Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, a significant promotion that some observers interpreted as recognition for his conclave role. While no evidence suggests impropriety, such appointments highlight the significant trust placed in non-voting conclave participants. Language barriers create additional vulnerabilities to manipulation, with cardinals from approximately 70 countries speaking dozens of different native languages. Many rely on translations or conduct discussions in languages they only partially command. This linguistic uneven playing field potentially advantages cardinals from major language groups, particularly Italian, English, and Spanish, who can communicate more effectively and build coalitions across linguistic boundaries. The 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis reflected this linguistic dynamic. As an Argentine of Italian descent, Cardinal Bergoglio possessed unusual linguistic versatility, fluent in Spanish and Italian, with functional knowledge of English, German, and French. This multilingualism reportedly enhanced his ability to communicate effectively with diverse cardinal groups during the crucial pre-conclave period. Health and age considerations create another potential vector for strategic influence. The average age of cardinal electors typically exceeds 70 years. With many experiencing health limitations that affect their stamina and potentially their decision-making during the physically and emotionally demanding conclave process. Cardinals dealing with health challenges may be particularly susceptible to influence from colleagues who provide assistance or demonstrate concern for their well-being. The conclave schedule itself, with multiple daily ballots and limited rest periods, creates physical and mental fatigue that potentially impacts voting decisions. As the conclave extends, the desire for conclusion naturally intensifies, potentially advantaging candidates perceived as capable of achieving the necessary consensus to end the process. This dynamic can be exploited by factions that maintain voting discipline while others fragment through exhaustion. The role of Cardinal Dean, who presides over pre-conclave meetings and certain conclave procedures, creates another position of potential influence. While lacking formal power beyond procedural management, this figure often shapes discussion topics and speaking opportunities during the critical general congregations, where most substantive debate occurs. During the 2013 pre-conclave period, Cardinal Angelo Sodano served as Dean of the College of Cardinals. His management of the general congregations reportedly emphasized governance challenges facing the Church, including Vatican financial transparency and curial reform, themes that potentially advantage candidates perceived as independent from Roman Curia interests. These various mechanisms of potential manipulation interact with the previously discussed external influences to create a conclave process far more complex and politically nuanced than the idealized narrative of spiritual discernment suggests. While not necessarily constituting outright rigging in the sense of fraudulent vote counts, these dynamics reveal a system where strategic coordination, information advantages, and persuasive tactics can significantly shape outcomes. As we synthesize what we've learned about the potential manipulation of papal elections, we must consider the implications for believers seeking to reconcile the idealized narrative of divine guidance with the complex realities of conclave politics. The tension between spiritual ideals and human maneuvering creates profound questions about the authenticity of the process that selects Catholicism's highest leader. The conclave system itself embodies this fundamental tension. Established in 1274 by Pope Gregory VI after a nearly 3-year papal vacancy caused by political deadlock, the conclave was designed to insulate papal selection from outside interference while compelling cardinals to reach timely decisions. The very word conclave derives from the Latin cum clave, with a key, referring to the practice of locking cardinals inside until they complete their task. This origin reflects both spiritual aspirations and pragmatic recognition of human tendencies toward delay, division, and external influence. Throughout subsequent centuries, the system has undergone numerous reforms aimed at addressing vulnerabilities to manipulation. Pope Pius X's 1904 abolition of the secular veto power, Pope Paul VI's 1970 exclusion of cardinals over 80 from voting, Pope John Paul II's 1996 simplification to a consistent 2/3 majority requirement, and Pope Benedict XVI's 2007 restoration of the traditional 2/3 threshold all represent attempts to preserve the conclave's integrity against various forms of potential distortion. Yet despite these reforms, the fundamental dynamics enabling strategic coordination, faction formation, and external influence persist. The conclave remains a human process conducted by individuals with personal perspectives, institutional loyalties, and susceptibility to persuasion. The elaborate ceremonies, solemn oaths, and spiritual symbolism surrounding papal elections may serve more to legitimize these human dynamics than to transcend them. For Catholics and other believers seeking to navigate this discomforting reality, several perspectives offer potential reconciliation between faith and the political dimensions of papal selection. First, the theological concept of divine accommodation suggests that God works through imperfect human systems rather than superseding them. Throughout salvation history, God has accomplished divine purposes through flawed human instruments and institutions, from the patriarchs to the monarchy of Israel to the apostles themselves. From this perspective, the political dynamics of conclaves need not negate divine involvement, but may represent the means through which providence operates in a fallen world. Second, the distinction between primary and secondary causality in Catholic theology provides another framework for understanding these tensions. God as primary cause may guide ultimate outcomes while working through secondary causes, including cardinal factions, strategic coordination, and even self-interested maneuvering. The presence of political dynamics need not exclude divine guidance any more than natural processes exclude divine creation. In Catholic understanding. Third, the Vatican II concept of the signs of the times suggests that historical contexts and challenges themselves may reflect divine communication to the Church. The emergence of papabili, whose characteristics address contemporary needs, Whether John Paul II's anti-communist background during the Cold War, Benedict XV's theological depth amid doctrinal confusion, or Francis's administrative independence amid institutional scandals, may reflect providence working through historical circumstances rather than despite them. For those less inclined toward theological interpretations, a more pragmatic assessment might focus on whether the conclave system, despite its vulnerabilities to manipulation, nevertheless produces leadership appropriate to historical circumstances. The College of Cardinals, while subject to political dynamics, comprises individuals with extensive pastoral and theological formation who collectively possess considerable institutional wisdom. Their deliberations, even when shaped by strategic considerations, may represent a form of collective discernment that transcends individual limitations. Nevertheless, several reforms could potentially address the most concerning aspects of conclave manipulation. Greater transparency around pre-conclave discussions would reduce opportunities for hidden coordination while still protecting the sanctity of the formal voting process. While complete elimination of strategic communication seems unrealistic, official acknowledgement of its existence and clear ethical guidelines could help distinguish legitimate deliberation from inappropriate campaigning. Expanded diversity within the College of Cardinals would reduce the impact of entrenched networks and regional blocs. Pope Francis has taken significant steps in this direction, appointing cardinals from previously unrepresented regions and from pastoral rather than primarily administrative backgrounds. Continuing this diversification would further diminish the influence of traditional power centers. Technological safeguards against surveillance and communication interference could better protect conclave integrity in the digital age. While current measures include electronic sweeps and signal jamming, more sophisticated countermeasures may be necessary to ensure that conclave deliberations remain truly isolated from external manipulation attempts. Procedural reforms to the voting system could reduce vulnerabilities to strategic manipulation. Options might include simultaneous rather than sequential revelation of voting results, altered majority requirements that reduce the power of blocking minorities, or anonymous discussion periods that allow more open exchange of perspectives without the pressure of visible alliance formation. Enhanced spiritual preparation for cardinal electors might strengthen their resistance to inappropriate influence. While cardinals currently engage in spiritual exercises before conclaves, more extensive retreats specifically focused on discernment practices and awareness of psychological and social pressures could better prepare them to distinguish spiritual promptings from political calculations. For the average Catholic in the pew, reconciling faith in divine guidance with the political realities of papal selection ultimately requires a mature understanding that God works through human history rather than apart from it. Just as the inspiration of Scripture did not eliminate the human characteristics and limitations of biblical authors, so the guidance of the Holy Spirit in papal elections need not eliminate the human dynamics of institutional governance. This perspective aligns with the Catholic theological principle of incarnation, the understanding that divine presence manifests through material reality rather than bypassing it. From this viewpoint, the political dimensions of conclaves may represent not a contradiction of divine guidance, but its incarnational expression through the complex realities of human community and institutional life. For non-Catholic observers of papal transitions, the tension between spiritual ideals and political realities offers insights into broader questions about religious leadership selection across traditions. All religious institutions face similar challenges in identifying and elevating leadership that authentically represents their spiritual values while effectively addressing practical institutional needs. The Catholic Church's long historical experience with these tensions provides a particularly well-documented case study in the inevitable interplay between divine and human factors in religious governance. The question, "Is the conclave rigged?" thus admits no simple answer. The process contains genuine vulnerabilities to manipulation through faction formation, strategic voting, information advantages, and external influence. Yet it also includes authentic spiritual elements, institutional wisdom, accumulated through centuries of experience, and mechanisms designed to mitigate the most egregious forms of interference. Perhaps the most accurate assessment recognizes that papal elections occupy a middle ground between purely spiritual discernment and purely political contest. A human process conducted with spiritual purpose, subject to manipulation but not defined by it, imperfect yet resilient. This complex reality may disappoint those seeking perfect divine determination of papal succession, but it aligns with the Catholic understanding of a church both divine and human, guided by the Spirit, yet marked by the limitations of its earthly manifestation. Like, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be among the first to receive our insights on developments within the Catholic Church and religious institutions worldwide. Drop a comment below. How do you reconcile the spiritual and political dimensions of religious leadership selection? Do you think reforms to the conclave process are necessary, or does the current system adequately balance divine guidance with human realities? Your perspective enriches this important conversation about faith and governance in our complex world. When human systems meet divine purposes, wisdom recognizes both the reality of our limitations and the possibility of transcendence working through them. Not perfect processes, but perhaps the best we can achieve this side of eternity.